Hi, this is Son of the Honda Mäkinen, and today I'm bringing you another double feature top 5. So we're having two top 5s for the price of one. Today the subject is Jim Carrey. Now the thing that always surprises me about Jim Carrey is that there are actually people out there that don't really like him as an actor, but he's personally one of my favorites. And just to show that Jim Carrey is an actor with not just comedic talents, but also some very impressive range. This list is going to list my top 5 favorite Jim Carrey movies by two criteria. Firstly, we'll have my top 5 serious Jim Carrey movies, because Jim Carrey has done some serious movies. And then we're gonna have the comical ones, so the Jim Carrey movies that I feel are the most fun to watch and most entertaining. And as far as the comical list goes, those are all my personal preferences, and so I don't want to challenge anyone's opinion on what they consider to be Jim Carrey's funniest movie. The serious films, for me personally, are the films that I was impressed with because of Jim Carrey's performance in them, but also because of the subject matter that they were about. But enough talking, let's get to the first list, which is the top 5 serious Jim Carrey movies. Alright, number 5, Batman Forever. Now, there might be some of you out there who are ready to shoot me for putting Batman Forever on a list of serious films, but really, it's not a straight comedy anyway, and Jim Carrey is playing a genuinely psychotic character in this one. But I have to say that there is a lot more entertainment value, which perhaps does not make this as serious as the other films I'm about to list. But you can tell that there is a genuine glint of insanity in Edward Nygma, which is why I always found it a very delightful performance by Jim Carrey. In fact, this is why Batman Forever is probably my favorite Batman movie, and why the 1989 Batman with Jack Nicholson as the Joker is not. But I'm not here to badmouth Jack Nicholson. I'm here to simply point out how much I love Jim Carrey's performance and how I really love Batman Forever just because it's the best cast Batman movie out there. But like I said, it's not the most serious film, and Edward Nygma's story, although a big part of it, is perhaps not the most complex out there. Which is why I had to put it at number 5, because there's much more deeper stories that I'm going to be talking about in the next few movies. However, I had to pick something for number 5, and Yes Man and the number 23 did kind of come close to being on this top 5, but I decided that if I was going to make a list of 5 Jim Carrey movies that I love, I might as well talk about movies that I have very strong feelings about, and Batman Forever definitely qualifies in that regard. Number 4, I Love You, Philip Morris. Now, despite some fan heckling talking about how Jim Carrey in Batman Forever was his first gay role, no, it was not. This was. I Love You, Philip Morris is an interesting movie because it's a biopic. It's based on real events, and for obvious reasons, I don't look to movies that are about homosexuals in general. But I was both delightfully surprised and generally impressed with the overall level of the movie. The story itself is very interesting. And I have to say, it took me by surprise, but it is definitely now one of my favorite Jim Carrey movies. And of course it has Ewan McGregor in it, which is pretty awesome. Yeah, and that's why it's at number 4. Now, there are certain weaknesses to this film, and partially the fact that it's so racy, and there's a pretty gross sex scene at the very beginning of the film, but it is a very, very good movie. I highly recommend it if somebody skipped it just because it's about a homosexual con man. If some people didn't like the idea of that, it's actually very, very good and very, very interesting, and I highly recommend it. Number 3, The Truman Show. Of course, how could this movie not be up here? But a lot of people might be wondering why it's not up higher. Well, I really like the idea of The Truman Show, the whole paranoia idea that your entire life is basically a big reality show that you're not aware of. It's pretty compelling stuff. And the idea of how this story unravels to the character that Jim Carrey plays in the film is really the main attraction. But I do feel that it's a little weak on coming up with with a solid ending, really. It's fun to see how Truman sort of realizes slowly how that he's not living in a real town, and it's really fun to see like all the other characters or the actors playing his family and everything to freak out, to suddenly realize that Truman is realizing the truth. But I feel that the movie doesn't come to a really good climax, and that's the only bad thing, but it is a very interesting, very good movie, and definitely worthy of being in the top 3, so that's why I'm putting it on number 3. But there are 2 other movies that I like even more, which is why it's only at number 3. Number 2, the most underrated Jim Carrey movie of all time, The Cable Guy. This is a dark comedy, and in that regard, it could easily be on either of the lists, but I felt that I need to point this out, because it's not the comedy of this film. In fact, the comedy of the film is not even the main point at all, which is why this film was so badly received in its day, and also why people still don't seem to give it the respect I personally appreciate. I mean, the whole reception of the film is best embodied in that famous quote, "Dry land is not a myth. I've seen it. Waterworld. I don't know what the critics were complaining about. I saw that movie 10 times. I loved it." But anyway, The Cable Guy is a great movie. It's a movie about a seriously disturbed individual who watched way too much television growing up, and as a result has some serious problems, but is also a stalker. So it's kind of a tragic story of a tragic nutcase who's also very dangerous and, is trying to force his way into this guy's life. It's a really great movie. It's one of my personal favorites, and I don't think it's ever received the appreciation it deserves. It's one of those forgotten gems of Jim Carrey's career, and I highly recommend people see it. Then for the number 1 serious Jim Carrey movie, no surprises here, it's Man on the Moon. Of course, this movie is about the life of the famous self-proclaimed song and dance man Andy Kaufman, who was among other things, a brilliant comedian, but also a great fan of practical jokes. He did some amazing things during his lifetime, and of course was best known for playing the role of Latka Gravis on the sitcom Taxi, a role and a show which he famously hated. Which always makes me feel a little conflicted, because not only is Taxi actually one of my favorite sitcoms, Latka Gravis is one of the main reasons I love it. But there was so much to the person of Andy Kaufman, that this entire movie, which I will stress is not entirely historically correct, and that's actually addressed at the very beginning of the film, but it's easily one of the best performances by Jim Carrey, especially considering how he doesn't actually look anything like Andy Kaufman, but he perfectly embodies the persona that Andy Kaufman was trying to portray in his lifetime. So, if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it. It also introduced me to what is easily my favorite REM song of all time, Man on the Moon, which was actually done much earlier than the movie, but it fits the story and the mood so perfectly, and it's used as a theme several times throughout the film. So, definitely check that one out. Alright, time to get on to the next top 5, which is the top 5 comical Jim Carrey movies. So, the Jim Carrey movies that I think are the funniest in order, from 5 to 1, and starting from number 5, The Mask. Now, there's a lot of people who are a little split on The Mask. Some people still love it to this day, like I do. Some people feel that it's a little outdated. Personally, I don't get that argument, because there's not actually that much CG in the film, and second of all, I think Jim Carrey is just hilarious in that green makeup. But I will admit that the movie wasn't quite as memorable, and ironically, as the cartoon show that was based upon it, which I'm sure nobody remembers, but which had Rob Paulsen doing the role of Jim Carrey's character, Stanley Ipkiss, a.k.a. The Mask, perfectly spot on, and he even sang the theme song. But the movie itself, it still has a great amount of comedic appeal, and it still is slightly more truer to the darker tone of the Dark Horse comic book, which it was based on, even though it's principally a comedy. So, it's a little split, and that's why I put it at number 5, but I still love the movie very much, and I do recommend people see it if they haven't. Number 4, Bruce Almighty. When it comes to Jim Carrey's real-life farce films, so to speak, I've always had a difficulty picking which film I thought was better, this or Liar Liar. But I do have to say that Bruce Almighty, although it has its strengths, it also has its weaknesses. The main thing is, although the film is really, really funny, I don't think the comedy ages as well, and perhaps because Jim Carrey is forced to hold back a lot of the craziness, because even though he's a god, he's not a complete nutjob in this film. But it is really, really funny, and Morgan Freeman as God is is an excellent character for him to play off of. And a lot of great gags and stuff. Although, I do feel at this point, because I have the DVD with all the cut material, it almost feels like the movie could have been even better with some of that material reinserted. But, that's just my opinion. Personally, I still think it's a great movie, and I highly recommend it. Number 3, Dumb and Dumber. Believe it or not, I only recently saw this film, but it was one of the most hilarious films I have ever seen. I laughed myself silly. And it is a great film overall. And I have to say that Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels play off each other brilliantly in this film. The main thing that makes it so great is that Jim Carrey is allowed to be a complete and utter moron. And this is when he's at his best, because there's no restraint on the stupidity, and it's absolutely brilliant. Now, why is Dumb and Dumber only number 3? Well, I would say it's pretty high, considering it's in the middle of the top 5. But yes, I do have to say that some of the comedy in this film was a little too juvenile, even for my taste. It is a great film, and it's great to try and figure out which of the two characters, Harry and Lloyd, is actually the dumber in the Dumb and Dumber. But it's still a surprisingly funny film, and it's still funny on several viewings. Unlike the Mask series, the cartoon adaptation just didn't do it justice. Number 2, well, this is 2 movies, because I could not, for the death of me, decide which one I liked best. So, sorry for bending the rules, but here it is. At number 2, it's Ace Ventura and Ace Ventura: Nature Calls. So yes, it was really difficult, but Jim Carrey's role as Ace Ventura is easily one of the best, funniest roles that he has ever played or ever will play, and I obviously love it very much. But it's really difficult for me to try and pick a favorite between the 2 movies, because there really isn't any way for me to objectively compare the 2, because, for one thing, they're both comedies, but even from a set group of the same attributes. Because Ace Ventura 1 is actually much more of a movie where Ace Ventura is this crazy character in a somewhat realistic world, compared to Ace Ventura 2, which is much more crazy and unreal and has a more movie-esque feel. So just because of the milieu, you might feel this is a bit of a cop-out, but because of the difference in the milieu of both films, it is really difficult for me to actually find any comparable elements, because between the movies there aren't even a lot of reoccurring roles or anything like that. Both movies are great for different reasons. It wouldn't even matter if I tried to compare catchphrases or individual gags. It would just not be possible for me to pick one over the other. So these movies come together, and you have to really see one or both of them to appreciate how great they are. In the cases of some sequels that are bigger than their predecessors, which I feel is the case with these 2 movies, in some cases the latter is clearly superior, whilst in some cases I prefer the down-to-earth feel of the original. But with Ace Ventura, it's simply not possible. The character itself is so over the top that it really works in almost any setting, and that's why they're both number 2. Alrighty then, it's time for number 1, And you might have guessed it already. It is Liar Liar. Why? Because Liar Liar has never lost its comedic appeal for me. Most comedies are not as funny on the second viewing, and they're even less funny on the third viewing. But Liar Liar is not one of those movies because the gags are so over the top and crazy. Every time I watch the movie, I seem to notice something different, a different nuance of each individual gag, if you will. And because of that, Liar Liar has been personally my favorite Jim Carrey movie ever since I first saw it. Now, I said that I wasn't completely sure whether I liked Liar Liar or Bruce Almighty better, and the problem was that these movies came out pretty much back to back. Well, there was some time difference, but for me, I saw them very close to one another, and that's why I perhaps because there's these sort of real-life farces where something completely unreal happens in a real-life setting, it was difficult for me to pick a favorite because the ideas behind the films seemed so similar. Yet when I watched Liar Liar again much later, I realized how much more I liked it. Now, I do have to say that Bruce Almighty is a much more polished film overall, but because of that, I feel that it's also not crazy and as off the wall as Liar Liar, which is what I liked about that movie. So, overall, Liar Liar is my favorite comedic Jim Carrey movie. And that wraps up this top 5, these two top 5s, and I'll see you on the next one!